I am so thrilled to welcome back our own, I feel like I can call you our own, Carrah Q. If you don't know much about her, she does hold a master's degree with distinction in philosophy and ecumenics from Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, and has a BA in religious studies from the University of Arizona. Her talk today is a heavy topic. It also happens to be a part of her own personal story. And she wanted me to encourage you guys, if she strikes a nerve or anything with any of you, I'll just know she is highly available and happy to talk. But without further ado, let's welcome back Carrah Q.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, family, community, friends, everyone. I'm going to try to ground myself as much as I can. In my anthropology of religion class, that's required when you're an undergraduate for religious studies, I learned that there is a way in which indigenous people handle a member of their tribe who has transgressed. This is true for small crimes and very deep crimes. They gather around the person as a tribe, and they ask them, "What did we do wrong? What can we do for you? And what was it about us that allowed for this transgression to happen within you?" In our society, our tendency, and I'm going to be specific about a school shooting, is to say, "I hope they rot in hell. People who murder are evil. We have nothing to do with crazy people who go get guns and do this. We are separate from them. We have nothing to do with what they did. The memories of them are wiped out, and their story is cast aside because they don't deserve a second thought. They are not a part of us." How different those reactions are in cultures. Vulnerable boys, prone to mental illness, are born into an American society that creates school shooters. 20% of the school-aged American male population is caught in a dynamic called the bully and the whipping boy. Once established in grade school, this dynamic will hold 20% of our boys until they leave the school environment. More than likely, during this period, mental illness has set in, or at least the seeds have been planted. In addition, the American way of educating our youth through standardized tests and single-minded thinking strips people of any imagination or ability to see beyond the school social structure. We are all tricked into believing the structure is real and that it matters. We are highly dualistic in how we view our society of the haves and have-nots, of the winners and losers, of the victims and those who are to blame. There are only polarities, not webbed realities of a multitude of avenues that can be explored while tackling an issue. The avenues always exist. It's just up for us to see them and take them. And finally, we raise our boys without permission to feel the range of human experience. We lock them away in molds of one-sided masculinity, which traps them into false promises of a heroic life fit for a Greek god. How do I know this? I am the daughter of a school shooter. In January of 1955, 19 years before I was born, my father planned a mass murder of his dormitory on his college campus. He strapped himself with ammunition, carried several loaded guns in both hands, and entered the dorm. He walked down a hallway, unsure of who to kill first. He finally landed at a door, decided to open it, set down his flashlight, shot into the dark toward a bed, and he knew instantly he had killed someone. In the next millisecond, my father says, a hand reached around his heart and squeezed it tight and stopped it for several beats. And he knew then, in that moment, that he had been loved, far more than he had ever accounted for. And he knew that that love was far more than any of the hate that he had felt in his heart before. He went to the police station. He turned himself in. He was arrested. He was put on trial. There was an insanity commission, and he was found to be incurably insane, and he was sentenced to a life sentence at a mental institution for the criminally insane, and he went there to live for the rest of his life. At some point in those first few years, in a very benign moment that was unremarkable, he had a revelation. He realized that he mattered. He realized that his body, his essence, and his purpose was something worthy, and he had never had that thought before. Whatever was in him, whatever brought him there, had left. The warden and the chaplain also agreed, and they began proceedings to have him set free. After 4 years and 9 months, my father went free, and he lived a normal life since then. When my father told me his story, I was 19 years old. I don't have time to go into the effect of what his story did to my life or any of the other details about his time in the mental institution. There are so many different ways to look at this. This is a very large story in my family's life, and we only have time for just a short bit. But like I said, I am available to talk about all of it if you need to. I want to share with you his story and why he believes he did what he did. At the age of 4, my father was walking down the street with a friend in a small town in Pennsylvania. A neighborhood boy, out of nowhere, came up behind him and pulled his pants down. All the other kids gathered and laughed. My father was left to pull up his pants and run home, and thus began 10 years of bullying. My father's world was shaped by the idea that anyone, at any moment, could humiliate you and degrade you and get away with it. School is life for a child. And because he grew up in a very small town, the kids in the neighborhood were the same kids at school. My father was smart. He was and still is brilliant. But no matter how smart he was, the most significant identity he could hold on to was that he was a loser. And everyone else was a winner. When you are bullied, it is you against the entire world. It's not just about the few bullies that taunt you. You cannot make the distinction as a child. My father would tell me over and over again that these were the incidents that shaped his entire world. My grandmother, his mother, was powerless to penetrate this dynamic, and so was his peer group. By the time he got to college, he was a powder keg. Being away from home for the first time, staying in the dorm with people from a much higher income bracket, and social skills that far exceeded my father's, proved to be very challenging. There was great debate about whether or not my father was bullied in the dorm. I have met many of the men in the dorm. Michael Dukakis was in the dorm. Some of them say he was not bullied. Some of them say he was. Some of them told me they tried to get others to stop. Others said it was just boys being boys. This was typical pranks in college. There was nothing out of the ordinary. None of what happened is a justification for violence, but it is necessary to see that even mild rowdiness would trigger someone like my father. This is no one's fault, and no one could have known. My father's world began to unravel. He was fighting with his girlfriend, his grades were slipping, and he was in danger of losing his scholarship. The boys in the dorm took his mattress out into the quad, they peed on it, and they set his garbage can on fire. My father was the room attendant. which is why he had the key to every room. This would have been an affront to him, I am sure, because he was the one that had to keep order. And so after this incident, my father snapped. This is a true story. And this is the cocktail. The most crucial part of a story of a school shooting is that of the killer. It is the longest arc of history that we know before the incident takes place, and it is the one that no one wants to face or talk about. People want more weapons for teachers, and yet they never think about how easy it is for someone so young to get weapons themselves. We want to call school shooters evil or horrible people and cast them off as if they existed in a vacuum, cut off from the rest of us, only to emerge into the world once they want to commit such horror. They exist alongside of us at all times, trying their best to make sense out of the social norms and patterns they seem so foreign to, and at times we even question. Hear me here. There is no such thing as a lone shooter. They are a part of the anatomy of our society. They have mothers and fathers and siblings and friends. School shooters find avenues which are easily laid out for them by the culture that we live in. The games they play, the TV shows they watch, the movies Hollywood creates are all interpreted in the hero-loser dynamic. Every shooter longs to be a hero. They believe themselves to be a part of that narrative. So to get weapons easily, which you can, like heroes in movies, to take care of your problems through violence, like countries do, is to do the noble thing. After everyone dies, they believe they will stand victorious. We associate this with a sick mentality, and it is. But it's only sick when it's carried out by a real person. Otherwise, if it's framed and understood in a make-believe plot, we pay money and buy popcorn and watch in awe and admiration at that plot line. My father is not a sociopath. The few school shooters that are alive and in prison are also not sociopaths. I am not saying that all school shooters are not sociopaths. I am saying that this dynamic is different than what we see when it comes to most homicidal sociopaths. My father would tell you he believed he was solving his problems. He actually thought his mother would be very proud of him and hug him. He wanted to kill everyone because everyone represented the enemy. My father's victim was most definitely not a bully, and I have to say that for sure. And even if he was, no one deserves to be killed. But no matter what victim my father randomly chose, and all victims are random in school shootings, they represent the vague idea of everyone. The whole world is after you when you are bullied, and you have no idea how to begin to solve the problem because it's too great. Our inability to cope with our problems stems from a system that educates based on singularity and teaches us nothing about life skills and coping mechanisms. Our educational system is hell-bent on streamlining and standardizing its approach to how it teaches our children. Part of what makes up school shootings and how we react to them is an outgrowth of the dehumanizing of education and the social structure. As you fill in your SAT answers with your number 2 pencil, you are aware at every question that there is only one right answer. And every question you are ever asked in school is formulated to that end. One right answer. It's a trap. Our schools must shift from strict academic education to create whole people rather than money makers, to create compassionate, complex thinkers rather than standardized test achievers, to create social systems in schools that celebrate the intelligent people alongside the awkward, the cheerleader, and the drama geek, allowing time in each day to live without labels, to have a check-in and eye to eye with an adult and with each other as people instead of cliques. Our social systems are built on lies. When we grow up, some of us find this out, and it's too late. I know many depressed mortgage owners. I know anxiety-ridden socialites and former big men on campus who call me destroyed by their internal sense of emptiness. The jocks that you thought had it all. When I talk to men who have made it through the American educational system, they often tell me they were only ever given permission to have two emotions, the duality of joy and anger. They tell me they weren't ever taught how to cope with rejection or not winning. The only permissible reaction to any of those things was anger. And often they don't know how to control that anger. Being a human with a range of possible ways to feel is not permitted. Families often reinforce this. This is a generational problem. If you look back at American school shootings since, yes, 1840, you will find a startling theme. They are almost all revenge killings. A young man felt betrayed, judged, or wronged in some way, and picked up a gun and went to his school. We have to admit that this is an issue with our culture. We need to wake up. Wake up. It's in the media's best interest not to solve this problem. This is what they live for. They've been following a script since Columbine. They design everything to be shallow and dramatic. We can't examine the life of the shooter because it glorifies them somehow. We can't find out why they did what they did because somehow if we find out, it will mean that we give it permission or somehow it justifies it. We can't blame ourselves because then that would make us guilty. The way to show compassion is to grieve only for the victims. There is a correct way to grieve, and only one way to see it. That person was crazy and evil, and that's all we have to think. One right answer. My unique position has put me in what I thought was a quandary for many years. Being raised in a dualistic thinking society, I thought I had to choose between loving my father and mourning his victim, and all the victims and wounded since 1955 in our country, which now total in the hundreds of thousands. They are the veterans of our culture. Do I choose an innocent life to grieve over, or do I side with the man on the other side of the gun? A man who I know to the deepest depths. When 15 crosses were planted on a hill in Littleton, Colorado, following the Columbine tragedy, the parents of some of those victims came and sawed 2 of them down. The killers could not be represented. I don't blame them. But how hard I cried when I found that out. I know those 2 crosses very well. Who will weep for the shooters? Who are Americans? Who are our boys? Who know, just like we do, what it's like not to be listened to? Who feel left out just like we have? Who suffer from mental illness just like we do? These are our boys. We are not separate. Who will understand that just because I grieve for the shooter, I can also grieve for the victims and the families? And I do, on a very deep level. Who will understand that complex thinking is healthier and more compassionate than one-sided grieving? If you don't have compassion for all involved, you don't have compassion. You have selective sympathy. The definition of compassion has a totality in it. It doesn't leave anybody out, and that's what makes it difficult to be a compassionate person. It is work. I'm not saying that the victim's family should feel sympathy for my father or any school shooter. I cannot ask that, nor am I. But the society at large must cope with the problem as a whole. I have no idea why I was born to a man that would teach me this, or why I was raised in a society during a certain era where this crime gets multiplied in more horrific ways each time. When I was growing up, unbeknownst to me, there were only a handful of relatives of school shooters. And now we measure in the thousands. We are an American demographic. Sue Klebold, the mother of one of the shooters at Columbine, wrote a book about her son, trying to piece together what happened to him. It sits on my bookshelf, and I am too terrified to read it. Too scared to know that had I called her like I wanted to 18 years ago, I could have spared her some little bit of guilt and remorse. I'll never know if I could have. I'm too terrified to read it because I know I'll be able to relate to it far too much. Relatives of shooters is a club that no one wants to belong to. I can assure you of that. The guilt and remorse that we feel is tremendous. We stand directly in the middle of this ongoing national tragedy. Many of us are too afraid to speak. Many of us are too horrified to have a voice. And we also know that the way society thinks in its dualistic way, we will be the touchstones for hatred. After Virginia Tech, I thought about Cho's mother. I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about Sue Klebold. Mothers of shooters have an unbelievable burden. While I cannot speak for others, I do know that in the midst of the suffering for their sons, they are very much focused on the victims and their families. Through understanding their plight, we can see the possibility and the necessity in taking stock of the whole. They do not believe their children are evil. They had to piece together a puzzle that most of our society is too frightened and unwilling to face. This is an American problem. It is our problem. School shooters did not invent their own dynamic. They fell into it. They were able to find what they needed to fulfill their fantasies by being in a society that most certainly enabled their behavior. Allow your boys to cry. Allow them to see you cry. Tell them your story. Take them to art museums where they can look at the work of others who have struggled with rejection and the undefinable. Show them that pain can be interpreted with a paintbrush, a musical instrument, or a pen. Tell them the tales of real heroes who overcame sadness, grief, and isolation and turned their lives around without the use of weapons. Tell them that even though our country goes to war to solve things, you don't have to. Show them that vulnerable men are the titans of humanity. Live with your flaws and sadness exposed. Be real. Give them no other expectation except to be a human being. The facts are, talking with or being exposed to the stories of school shooters is very rare. Most of them kill themselves or are killed by law enforcement for good reason. So we must move forward understanding that we have to be in the mode of prevention. Be vigilant. Admit that we are linked. Acknowledge we are together in this. As a tribe, let us gather around our boys and ask, what can we do for you? What do you need? Are you okay? How are you? We must make sure that none of our boys feel separate. I am here to tell you, my loving and beautiful community, that my father's legacy is not that he was only a killer, but that he turned out to be quite a remarkable human being. And I am so incredibly proud to have him as my father. There's so much more to this story. There's nothing that can bring back that beautiful soul that he extinguished. But what he taught me about compassion, forgiveness, and acknowledging the web of humanity has forever empowered me to keep talking, keep showing, and keep exploring the ways that we can heal and prevent this horrible sickness in our midst. And I do hope in that way he has found some form of redemption. I intend to be a part of the solution for many years to come, and I hope you will join me. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Are you up for questions? Do you want to take questions?
I will take any question you want. And just to let you guys know, everything in the world has been said to me or asked of me, so don't feel like anything's inappropriate. Even if you disagree with all of this, I've had it and I've taken it, okay?
All right. Wow, it's like the most hands we really have, so it'll take a second.
Carrah, I know men are supposed to have a certain feeling about themselves. Oh, I'm sorry, I always do that. And a certain reputation for themselves. Where do women fall in this kind of thing?
Women get more internalized. They're more likely to commit suicide or more likely to be depressed and withdraw. Men externalize. Those are just statistical facts about it. I'm not saying that there haven't been women that have gone with guns to schools. I'm just saying that the generalization I'm making can be a true one.
Thank you for your presentation. One of the things that comes up for me is a concept of collective responsibility, and I think we all share in that, and I would like your feelings on that concept.
I think parents need to pressure schools to get life skills into the curriculum. I think that I don't want to make this a commentary on the feminist revolution of the 70s, but I think once you had a dual income household, there was less eyes on the children. I'm not saying it had to be women on the eyes on the children. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that once the double income began to be more of a trend, there was less of an impact in a domestic way on keeping an eye on children. My dad came from a single parent household, and I'm not saying that the killers at Columbine came from dual parents, but in a way, I think that there's less eyes on our children that have to do with personal interaction and more about, did you get your homework done? Did you clean your room? And there's less human interaction. That's just my impression over the last 40 years. I think that to begin, we have to demand that the curriculum reflect humanity instead of the test taking and the state achievement things. That's just the beginning.
I just wanted to thank you for your speech, and I didn't know if this was the first or second time you had done this, or if you'd done this many times.
This would be my third.
Keep it up, sister, and I really liked your message.
Thank you.
And we need to get that out there. I mean, you're right on target on on all that stuff. So, and I'm really proud of you, and I'm glad to be here to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yep.
Thank you.
As a school teacher, I come across this idea a lot. And one thing that I noticed you didn't mention was, or talk too much about the people that bullied your dad, and what really is done after these things happen about the people who initiate the bullying, and what's done about to help them or why they do this. Because I notice a lot of times, specifically in my case of students who have committed suicide because of bullying, nothing's done about it. Like this past school year, I had a student that was being severely bullied, and nothing was done about it until the student came out and physically talked to a teacher and said, "I want to kill myself." So I was wondering how you felt about, or what to do about the students, and where this comes from of the bullying and the need to pick on people and to make people's lives miserable.
Well, everything starts with insecurity, and people manifest their insecurity in different ways. So bullies are caught in a dynamic too. They're unescapably a bully. They can't help but be kind of prone to this sort of aggressive behavior. And again, the aggressive behavior finds permission in our culture. So the bullies are caught up as well. Again, from a low self-esteem standpoint. Again, the dynamic works with these two groups. The 20% stay here, you know. There have been, in the case of suicide, several court cases in America over the last 5 years in which the bullies were brought to trial. I think that can be important, but ultimately it is the failure of the adults who don't know enough about the dynamic to see what's happening. And if we study it enough, there are signs. We can see this. If we know the signs of an eating disorder, we know the signs of suicide, we know the signs of drug use and addiction, we can know the signs of this bully whipping boy dynamic. It's easily teachable. I think there's more awareness than there ever has been. I think I see stickers that say bully-free zone or something like that. My daughter learned the word by the kindergarten. So I think that I don't know in the cases of mass shootings whether or not any bullies have given depositions in any way. I want to say that somewhere I know that there have been depositions by bullies. It's important not to hold them responsible necessarily for the violence, but also to find out and knit together what happened in the years preceding. So their story is very important. And to be honest, I believe that bullies want to leave the dynamic too. I think they get exhausted from having to keep this aggression up all of the time. So it's something that we really have to look at. I'm not an expert by any means at all in the bully category, so I hope I've given you a little bit of an answer to your question. But it's definitely, it's this whole other piece of the puzzle we have to look at, for sure.
You mentioned that this was distinctly an American issue, and I think that piece and parcel to the problem being that this is more of a worldwide issue, but it's slightly different. So, like, do you think that the rest of the world could take in part of bullying and fight it? Because we have like school shootings, but other countries like Japan have mass suicides where they don't have access to weapons. So like they express their bullying nature simply by jumping in front of trains or among that sort. So do you think that eliminating guns is the problem, or do you think that it should be a worldwide discussion? Because I don't really know the answer to this.
Well, I think part of it is access to weapons. I think that would be number one. My father will tell you he would never have been able to do what he did without guns and ammunition. Number two is the humanizing of our educational system. Having been to Japan, I know that their educational system can be very oppressive. And I think that part of their culture also admires suicide. So it's the honorable way out. And that, for their culture, it needs to shift for them as well, and there are people trying to do that there. But again, that's another example of a culture with an educational system that is dehumanizing. It doesn't happen as much in Europe because, again, they have to handwrite all of the answers to their questions. They have to think critically, they have to think in a complex way, and they don't have a social structure of winners and losers like we do so clear-cut here. Part of our duality problem is a big problem here. Duality, even though it exists in Western culture in general, in Europe it's not as big. So they have a lack of access to weapons. We have machine guns that 17-year-olds can get a hold of. They have a better social structure that honors people from all different stratums of life. They have a better mix of income levels. And they, again, have a more complex way of dealing with their education. So, even though everyone I know in Europe is terrified of their leaving certs, they still know that they have to write everything down. There is no multiple choice. There's no one right answer. There's no number 2 pencil issue. They have to be a full human being. They have to be able to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it might be a range of this. And so that's a totally different way of thinking than it is in America.
So to follow up, do you think that it would just need a ground-up restructuring of the education system in order, because everything else would just be a Band-Aid on top of the problem?
Exactly. Early childhood education has to begin first. Humanizing our children, knowing that they probably come from double-income households now, and so there's less eyes. And I really want to make clear, I don't mean that 2 parents that work aren't involved in their children. I'm just saying, I'm being general here. Early childhood education, those first 5 years are the most important. Remember, my dad's bullying started at 4. 4 in psychology is when you start your will. And if you lose your will, if you're abused by 4, or something happens in the family dynamic to destroy the will, you don't really have a chance to build it after that. Okay?
You touched on something that made me curious. You made it sound like that you had a connection to the mother of the Littleton, Colorado shooting, and I was wondering if you could go into more detail about that.
I don't have a connection to her. I simply relate to her grief, relate to her inability to ever be settled, her inability to ever extinguish all guilt. I just feel so much for her. That's all. I haven't personally contacted her, so I have her book and I'm too terrified to read it. That's all.
This will be the last question here. Time.
I was just wondering, as a parent of a young child, what can we do to demand humanization within our educational system? Because I have a child, a little girl, and she's biracial in an area that's not very common, and I've tried very hard to raise her as a single parent and to be strong and to be okay with rocking a mohawk and all of that, but I'm still terrified. And especially in a school where they sing songs that are generally found in church, how do I tell them this isn't okay, and how do I explain to them to be more humanizing instead of just teaching them a cute little song about not bullying but not doing anything when my child's terrorized?
Tell them just exactly what you said to me. And don't focus on being strong all the time. Show your child what it's like to be vulnerable. Show your child what it's like to have a really crappy day, and let her know that there's another day tomorrow. You've got to show your coping mechanisms and show that sometimes you don't know what to do. We have to be vulnerable with our children. We have to be the human for our children. We can't always be strong. We can't always be, right there all the time. We have to be able to be humans for them. Exactly what you said to me is exactly what you should tell the school. Show her what courage is like. Let her rock her mohawk. Children are not going to escape ridicule. No one does. No one's ever going to escape a bad day. No one ever escapes even slight bullying. No one escapes it. But how you cope is where we need to find the focus of how we teach our children. You're going to cry maybe for a few hours, and then you're going to buck up. Or you're going to find a way to teach them to speak to the bully or to find an adult. What my grandmother used to tell my mother was, why don't you fight back? And my father wasn't the fighting kind. So it never was going to work. because she also was not taught how to cope. She also was not taught about the playground. So that's why I say it's a generational thing. We have to really get it together for us too. Never be afraid to be vulnerable in front of your children. Okay?
Thank you, Carrah.
Thank you.